I used to be pro-life. I know this is a women's rights issue, but I'm going to mostly be talking to men. I've felt compelled to make this for a while, but recently FD Signifier made an excellent video on the manosphere and made a call for more men to share their experiences in less toxic ways and call out other men for bigotry or help them understand it. So, Feek, this is my addition to that conversation. So, I used to be pro-life / anti-choice. I was in a Christian pop punk band who made pro-life their main agenda and concern. We were involved with a variety of religious organizations. We rocked out in pro-life merch at pro-life festivals. Our lead guitarist had "Abortion is Murder" in giant letters on his guitar amp. And we played endless shows in front of a bunch of young, impressionable Christian teenagers our age that were also stoked about the pro-life movement. We marched in the March for Life one year, and we weren't even 20 at the time. Since my involvement in that movement, I've grown as a person, and I've become aware of the nuance of the abortion debate and what it means for women's rights to have safe access to it. Over the years, I listened to women's stories. I had relationships with women that I respected, and eventually the guilt of what I participated in with the pro-life movement finally sunk in. Throughout the years, though, I've tried to deconstruct the beliefs of my earlier self and where those beliefs came from, and that's largely what I'm going to be talking about in this video. In a nutshell, it boils down to the get them while they're young mentality that many Christian organizations have. But as with anything in this batshit crazy country, it's a lot more complicated than that. Let's start with my upbringing for backstory. Full disclosure, I am a pastor's kid, but it's not my pastor dad that instilled my early, legalistic perspective on Christianity. A legalistic Christian, by the way, is a Christian that takes the Bible 100% at face value. So the earth is 6,000 years old, evolution is a lie, we're living in the end times, etc. When I was 6, my stepdad came into my life. He was a former alcoholic that kicked it by becoming a born-again Christian, so his faith was pretty intense. He talked about and put the fear of hell in us very young, so we were always, worried about the eternal life of the people that we loved in our lives. He wouldn't let us date till we were 18. We weren't supposed to listen to secular music, although we often did anyway. And as far as his political message and stuff was concerned, he would just tell you to go in and press all the Republican bubbles. So, yeah. He listened to Christian radio nonstop, and he would make us listen to Christian radio in the morning times during the summer. It's not a big mystery how these experiences helped prime me to be pro-life, or at least pro-life on the surface. But fortunately, I had a good head on my shoulders, and I would argue against the black and whiteness of my stepdad's worldview and kind of carved my own way of thinking outside of his way of thinking. However, I was really, really in line with the way that he thought. I just called myself a centrist. I had the same, essentially the exact same views as him. I just had a different way of approaching them. I was apologetic for a lot of, the more extreme Christian figures on the right, and I had no understanding of the left outside of them being our mortal enemy. Before I did get too far into this, my born-again stepdad did eventually get better, so love you, Kurt. Around middle school, I started to make friends that were similarly raised in devout Christian homes. Before this point, I had several secular friends that consisted of us, playing video games, watching movies, and me trying to evangelize to them so that they didn't, have eternal damnation to look forward to. Anyway, several of these new friends that I had were from the local private Christian school, and they had transferred to public life, and I fell in with them because they listened to the same Christian artists that I did. I was not allowed to listen to secular music at the time. And here is where you really start to see the groundwork for the get them while they're young approach to conservatism. I considered myself a Christian soldier walking into middle school with a big chip on my shoulder. And I was wondering, how would I fare with all of these, secular heathen kids my age? But fortunately, I would not have to endure them in my core group of friends because they consisted of angsty, cishet Christian boys. The point is, I had found my pack, I'd found my echo chamber, and what brought us together was our shared experience of being brought into a vague holy war between the Christians and everybody else by our authority figures. At that point in my life, as much as I would deny it, I was a follower. Sure, I had some toxic ideas coming into this and was seriously anti-science. In school, I would put scientists believe before any answer involving evolution, just so I'd be cool with the G-man upstairs. But I had not really crossed into the realm of politics. I believed as a non-secular Christian person, I existed outside of that paradigm. That was for the non-believers. But then I met Luke. Luke came from a hardcore Christian household with less freedoms than my house. Where in my house, we could and would regularly get secular entertainment into our lives, Luke's parents were a bit more paranoid than that. They would intrude into his life constantly, checking for secular music or secular entertainment of any kind. They were not supposed to experience things outside of the Christian world, which was difficult for them, seeing as they were from public school. Luke lived in a brutal dictatorship at home. I saw some of my own experience in Luke, and we became fast friends. Our friendship started off with our shared love of pop punk, like Relient K or Blink-182. But quickly, right-wing politics got involved. Luke considered himself a young conservative and would be the first to shit talk anything remotely liberal, liberal media. He would shit talk feminists. And I still kind of considered myself a centrist, like I said before. But again, I would endlessly apologize for people on behalf of Luke because I was kind of his in-between guy. And I shared a lot of the same views that he did. I just didn't want to be viewed as ugly as he was viewed by a lot of people because of them. Basically, I was a conservative, but I didn't want to take the heat of taking on that title. Now, I want to stamp down and talk about this idea for a second because it is crucial to the pipeline from angsty young, politically unaffiliated Christian to Bible-thumping Republican. What I'm seeing now in young men today has the same trappings of being angsty, young, politically unaffiliated Christian, but without the Christian part. Being from a Christian background, I had what I considered ample footing for my stance on the abortion debate. I had bought into the idea that life begins at conception, supported by one flimsy Bible verse. It was bad reasoning then as it is now, but what troubles me today is we have young men jumping on the same wedge issue that divided our parents for decades, but they have no affiliation with faith. Many of them still call themselves centrists and simply don't talk about their personal opinion on the debate unless it's on an anonymous forum. If you browse r/2x chromosomes, or you just, listen to some of the women in your everyday life, you'll hear countless stories of women that well into relationships find out their partner has some problematic worldviews that they've been keeping to themselves in order to secure a mate or whatever the game BS is playing this week. And yes, sometimes the roles are reversed, both sides, but I'm talking about you dudes. So where was I? Right. So me and Luke were the dynamic duo of conservatism. And we strongly latched on to the idea that as a Christian, if you were persecuted for your beliefs, then you were doing the right thing. And we justified a lot with that. It gave us a sense of entitlement to our beliefs. We were fighting a war bigger than any non-believer could understand. And by defending the Christianness of our country, we were literally saving souls. I was experiencing what has now been coined aggrieved entitlement, and it completely consumed my identity at the time. So, what does any of this have to do with abortion? I'm getting there. Around the time of Bush II, the Chode Warrior, the abortion debate was hot and at the forefront of every politician's agenda. I won't get into the deeper history of how the Republican Party used abortion as a boogeyman to build an audience with the religious right. I will say that by the time I was starting to understand American politics, it had reached a point where even some Democrats were on the fence about the abortion debate. They accepted the right to abortion, but it was always with the caveat that it was only for the worst of situations and a last resort. The debates on the subject didn't emphasize the importance it represented to women's health, and it didn't take conservatives to task on their assertion that life begins at conception. By the way, for a more extensively researched video essay on the debate about life beginning at conception, definitely check out Khadija Mabo's Aborting the Sun essay. I'll put a link in the description. Bush beat Gore heavily based on his stance on abortion. That and his obvious ties to... This is where it gets tricky. At this point, if you were conservative, you had to be pro-life. It was not up for debate, really. The science was settled, and what we were seeing with abortion rates was akin to a Holocaust. What I know now, especially from having witnessed newer wedge movements like anti-vax, Trumpism, and the Stop the Steal stuff, is that they thrive on your emotional reactions and always present their side of the debate as something heroic and worthy of martyrdom. This worked like a charm on my insecure teenage brain for years. I was a warrior for the pro-life movement. But even then, I knew something deep down was wrong. So, for a little while, I was raised just by my mom. She was single and independent in the years following her and my dad's divorce. It wasn't a long part of my childhood, but I remember it fondly. It was when I first learned what a strong, independent woman was. She had ups and downs and struggled to make ends meet, but still managed to give us a loving, secure place to call home. I'd seen firsthand, because of that, the overwhelming difficulty that you face as a single mother or single parent in general in the United States. And I brought that experience to my discussions within the pro-life movement. Whenever the pro-life pop punk band Luke and I were in would be asked about our pro-life views, everyone around me would be repeating the variations of "it's a tragedy," "abortion is murder," "the right to life is fundamental to our country," and of course, "it's a states' rights issue." Then it always got around to me, and I would, of course, agree with all of those things, being the centrist that I was. But I would also add on to the conversation my caveat that if you are truly pro-life, you must support single mothers. You got to support children that are born from the choice. And the thing is, I found that time and time again, I was the only one saying that part. People would nod their heads in agreement with me, but then go right to the real task at hand, which was destroying safe access to abortion at all cost. And it ended there. No conversation about what the world would look like once it was illegal. I guess we were all meant to believe that once it was illegal, everyone would fall into place and we would start kumbaya-ing and there would be a healthy heterosexual relationships all around. Speaking of healthy heterosexual relationships, let's talk about the opposite. Now, the term incel, involuntary celibate, hadn't been coined yet, but me, Luke, and the rest of the band were definitely that. I'd adopted a very toxic and naive view on women since hitting puberty that was largely based on the views of the men and boys around me. For Luke, any issue in any relationship he was in was always her fault, and any girl that even had a hint of feminism in them was instantly the enemy. We believed that feminism was one, and that anyone still bringing it up was just trying to get attention or be argumentative. As for our celibacy status, it was only celibacy on the surface. This is key to the pro-life slash anti-choice movement. Saving yourself for marriage is still something that was being pushed by most conservatives into the 2000s, and the argument was that if you were mature enough to have sex, that you're mature enough to raise a child. This had the effect of putting all the shame on sexually active young women, while the young men pushing these views were often the same men desperately desiring and pushing for that sexual activity. Another effect that this had was convincing young men that they have an equal say in the choice to keep or abort a fetus if and when a girlfriend got pregnant. If you believed that life began at conception and your girlfriend made the decision to abort, it created a deeply troubling justification for young men to hold resentment or worse, commit violence against their partners for any number of things surrounding pregnancy. It gave a sense of entitlement over women's bodies, and if you didn't do everything you could to keep a fetus from being aborted, it was akin to assisting a murder. Also, keep in mind, this is pre-Me Too, and the prevailing dating strategies were not very consent-oriented, at least for men. That might sound awful, and it is, but let me explain. As a young, hetero boy in the 2000s, I was told by many boys and some girls in my life that you do not ask for a kiss. I asked for my first kiss and was ridiculed about it by my guy friends. When it came to sexual consent, it was the same. The name of the game for most men was to keep pushing the limits until the girl eventually relented and allowed you access to sexual activity. Examples of this behavior were all over our media, and plenty of YouTubers have made work of breaking down the innate non-consent that a lot of those movies thrived on. So I'm not going to do that right now.
You make it so difficult sometimes.
I do, I really do.
But part of what made that ambiguous attitude towards consent especially menacing in the 2000s was coupling that with the feeling of ownership over a woman's body and her bodily choices once she's made pregnant. With all these factors combined, your average pro-life, anti-choice incel of the 2000s resented women that would not relent to their advances, then when faced with a woman that became pregnant for not relenting, assumed a level of control over her choices. Sometimes that would take the form of convincing them to keep the fetus, but ironically, just as often, it would take the form of convincing them to abort it. It's not hard to understand, then, why many are adopting forced birth to describe the pro-life, anti-choice movement. Now, I'm not saying that this toxic attitude towards women is unique to the 2000s, but that's the portion I experienced as a young man, and so that's what I'm drawing from. What I'm seeing in the discourse among young men today is just as bad, if not worse. Back then, the majority of pro-life slash anti-choicers were clearly from the Christian conservative side of the aisle, a small group of loud Republicans that used it to rally like-minded individuals, and it was rarely based in anything resembling science. It was about beliefs in when the soul began and what its eternal rights were. There wasn't a multitude of lawmakers getting up to talk about bunk science one after another in an attempt to sound like there is evidence at all for life at conception. There were a few oddball Republicans that brought insane rhetoric to the table, but this is pre-Sarah Palin, so they were still keeping that shit in their pants. What bothers me about today's pro-life slash forced birth movement is that somehow there's an entire generation of incel millennials and Zoomers that have the same perspective that I formed through toxic masculinity and my legalistic Christian upbringing, but they got their perspective from a shared hatred of an SJW or woke worldview. There is this prevailing desire from these young men to escape any and all content they consider politically charged, while following a very clear and dangerous political agenda that they'd rather not talk about, and equating every rights issue with the Second Amendment, but that's a different discussion entirely. There's also this immediate distaste for anything that becomes a cultural touchstone, like Black Lives Matter, Pride Month, women's rights, or really representation in general. We just got done with Pride Month when I wrote this essay, and the majority of what I saw in various joke subreddits were memes complaining about any and all representation happening. They treat it like a fad that happens every year that only hipsters celebrate. And although it's true that corporations switch to rainbow flags in June and then go support conservative politicians in July, what I saw attacked every manner of Pride celebration, as if any support of it was superficial. Even worse, they framed Pride Month as if it was created to overshadow Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, which is also in June, unnecessarily pitting the two things against each other. Keep in mind, nobody, not even men, cared about or referenced Men's Mental Health Awareness Month until a few years back. And there's no reason that they can't also celebrate men's mental health awareness in their own way. But it seems that the way that they're celebrating is mostly just bashing gay pride. Most of these men I'm talking about are like I was in the 2000s. I fully considered myself a centrist, but I also supported exclusively right-wing ideas while largely ignoring the criticism that came my way for doing so. I considered myself above or outside the political spectrum. I bought into the notion that I didn't have to choose a side and that anyone consciously making a stand was a sucker. I bought into the lie that abortion being legal was a tragedy, that it was a moral and not political issue, and I bought and peddled the idea that abortion ought to be a states' rights issue and that government was overstepping its boundaries by having it federally protected. And during all that time, I called myself a centrist, and so did many around me. What I want is for this video to get around to otherwise progressive men that have a bad take when it comes to abortion. Since Roe v. Wade was struck down, it has become painfully apparent how many men are still harboring dangerous and sexist views on women's rights and acting as if losing Roe v. Wade isn't as big of a deal as it is. And that's sad. I know this video isn't going to convince anyone that is deep into the forced birth movement, but maybe I can knock a few of you guys off the fence who've been sitting on. Hey guys, a quick addendum to the video essay that I completely forgot to include in this story, but it's a very crucial part of it. My mom, when she was very young, before meeting my dad, had an abortion. And the reason that I bring that up is because it's a part of the conversation that is not often talked about, and that is the fact that there are plenty of families around that would not exist without access to abortion. There's plenty of people that talk about how there's potential that is being snuffed out when a fetus is aborted, but not nearly enough examples of people talking about how they wouldn't have existed if abortion was illegal, like me. So yeah, just thought it was a useful anecdote to add on to this, that yeah, there's a whole bunch of people out there that only exist because abortion is legal and we have access to it. So yeah. All right, off to the outro. So this is my first video essay, and I don't know how many of these I'll do, but mostly I needed to get this off my chest. Let me know what you think, and please feel free to flip through the other stuff in the channel for some less dense material. There's a few music videos I made, podcast clips, and a couple of interviews. But yeah, Thanks for watching, and yeah, try to be good to each other in the comments. Yeah, that'll work.